Good afternoon and welcome everyone to our Christian Recorder Dialogues. My name is John Thomas III and I am your editor of the Christian Recorder, newly minted Dr. John Thomas III. We just had graduation, which is why I have my Morehouse t-shirt on celebrating graduation as well as a kente cloth for celebrating Juneteenth. So we are here with our esteemed colleague, Reverend Dr. J. Augustine, one of our members of the Judicial Council, as well as the proud pastor of, let me get this right, St. Joseph's Church in Durham. And so we are here today to talk about this wonderful book, When Prophets Preach. But before we begin, we encourage you to place your name, your church, your bishop in the comments chat and be engaged. So this second discussion we're having in our Christian Recorder book series. Dr. Augustine, welcome to the TCR Dialogues.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be with you. Congratulations again, obviously, on earning your doctorate. You mentioned something about Morehouse College. I like to say it's the other school that was founded in 1867. So go HU. In the spirit of HBCUs, it's a pleasure to be with you, my brother. It's a pleasure.
Yes, we are excited to have you here as we celebrate Juneteenth as well as graduation. So let's just dig into this. You have given us this amazing, amazing book right here, which we have When Prophets Preach. And this is your second book that you've written. And so we want to talk about the work that you're doing. So first, let's just dig into this. I've read this book. I've read this book in planes. I read this book in my office, and I could literally not put it down before we got to this moment. What led you to write this book, When Prophets Preach?
Thank you. Thank you, number one. Thank you so much for your kind regards. And thank you, obviously, for the opportunity to participate with our viewers, to share not only with the AME Church, but to share with our ecumenical community. When Prophets Preach, quite frankly, you hit the nail right on the head. It is round two, and it is a continuation of where I began with the publication last year in 2022 of Call to Reconciliation: How the Church Can Model Justice, Diversity, and Inclusion, a work that was published by Baker Academic. If I can sort of go back to show how Call to Reconciliation dovetails directly into When Prophets Preach, and then give sort of a high-level overview of this book. I began writing certainly from a perspective of being proactive, and that I wanted to contribute something to both the church and the academy that I thought would be meaningful and good and very timely. But quite frankly, my work was very reactive in responding to social circumstances. And I will simply say the Make America Great Again narrative and all that that meant in terms of retrogression for our country. So in writing about reconciliation in a global context or in a holistic context, Call to Reconciliation flushes that term out in three domains: salvific reconciliation, social reconciliation, and civil reconciliation. And they are all directly connected. So if you can envision the cross, the two planes of the Christian cross, salvific reconciliation says that we are reconciled in our relationship with God through Jesus. It is salvific in nature. Jesus died for the remission of our sins, but Jesus didn't just die, Jesus also lived. So in moving from the vertical axis of the cross to the horizontal, it says that we are equal to one another in a social context. We are equal to one another because of Jesus, because of the way Jesus lived. A close cousin to social reconciliation, that second domain, is civil reconciliation, which is really the work of the prophet. It's the work of prophetic leaders, and the examples I use to demonstrate it are Martin King and the other concerned clergy and laity in the civil rights movement, who really said, if we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all people are created equal, then all must mean all. And civil reconciliation then is the work of the prophet in holding government's feet to the fire and making sure that there are opportunities extended to all. So with that domain of prophetic leadership, that led me into this book, into When Prophets Preach. It begins sort of with a foundational exploration of the Monis Triplex doctrine. Some call it the Munis Triplex doctrine, where we look at Jesus's leadership as a prophet, as a priest, and as a king, or as a royal in non-gender specific terms. And it looks at the work really of the prophet, obviously focusing on the work of the prophet to speak truth to power, to envision a world that is just, to move a congregation's interests, not just from what is going on in a very insular context to within the four walls of their church, but to a more universal context, how society is changing and what are their roles, what are they compelled to do based on faith and practice in society. So when Prophets Preach begins by looking at the work of the prophet and the social justice nature that we're called to fulfill in terms of our Christian beliefs and in following the example of Jesus.
Mm-hmm. What grabbed me about this text was the subtitle, Leadership and Politics in the Pulpit. And one of the claims that you articulate in the book, you talk about the fact that there is no divorce between the prophetic preaching and gospel. As some would say, the black people in the Black church often get maligned for politicizing the gospel. But in this book, you articulate that this is a narrative that really holds no water, that there is no, if the true gospel is a gospel that is prophetic. So
inherently political.
Yes,
the gospel is inherently political. Exactly. I want to draw a clear distinction. So from an etymological perspective, when you look at the origins of the word politics, polis or police, as it comes to our language, it means affairs of the cities. It has nothing to do with partisanship. It has nothing to do with whether one dons an R or a D or wears red or blue. It has everything to do with the allocation of resources, with fairness and equity among people or among state institutions. So prophetic preaching is political preaching, and the gospel is inherently political because when you look at Jesus's life, he didn't just come to usher in salvation in the kingdom to come. I'm paraphrasing Martin King here. Jesus came to usher in an area that was just in the kingdom at hand. So he dealt with political issues in his day. As a Jew who was socially marginalized, living under the dominion of the Roman Empire, he came to bring liberation to people. Again, not just salvation in a time to come, but to address social inequities here in the time at hand, or then in the time at hand. That is what Christian ministry is all about. It is inherently political, but not partisan.
You did my political science hard good to hear you say allocation of powers. I appreciate that. So the truncated gospel, that's what led me to the first piece, the truncated gospel. Can you talk a little bit more about that concept and how it falls into this play of the gospel of preaching being inherently prophetic and political?
Sure. So the gospel clearly is the good news, but it's not only the good news. There are several aspects of the gospel, and regrettably, so many of our churches are preaching a truncated gospel because they're not endeavoring to celebrate or to examine and to go through the full cycle of what the gospel really means. The ministry of lament, or the work of lament, is a requisite part of the reconciliation narrative. If we begin with the concept that reconciliation is a ministry that Jesus left to the church, Paul fleshes that out quite well in 2 Corinthians. Then if we are called on to be ministers of reconciliation in this day and age and to be in community with those who are unlike us, from a racial perspective, the proverbial other that is, from a racial perspective, we've got to recognize that America has a long story of white supremacy. The work of lament means we've got to own the fact that one group has been subjugated, one group has been dominant and has been doing the marginalizing. That can be very uncomfortable to talk about. When we move into the narrative of reconciliation, it requires reciprocal obligations on the part of the group that has been marginalized. And I'm talking now as an African-American, and certainly from an African-American perspective, that requires the hard work of forgiveness. And that begins with lament. On the opposite side of the coin, from a white perspective, or from the dominant perspective in America, it requires doing some things differently than have been done in the past. It requires undoing some systems and some systemic norms that have certainly inured to the benefit of the dominant group. That work is equally hard. So reconciliation is not for the faint at heart, but it begins with the work of lament. And again, the work of lament, liturgies of lament, that's probably the antithesis of praise parties that are much more popular, that are much more, if you want to think about offerings and people giving from a happy space, it is something that is not lifted up as often as I think it should be for the full cycle of what the gospel really is.
So let's dig into this piece of reconciliation, because I know reconciliation was important in your first book, and it also comes out in the second book. So you continue on articulating reconciliation as this ongoing process. So because reconciliation is ongoing, I was wondering with this point is, are we ever finished with the process of reconciliation? Does it ever stop? Or does it just change processes? And how does this policy play into reparations and healing? For example, does reconciliation stop once reparations happen, whatever form? Does reconciliation stop? I remember in my classes, we talk about Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. And you brought up the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, and the fact that those processes are to open wounds and begin talking, but just after the testimonies are over, the wounds are still there, the hurt is still there. Where do you move? So can you talk, let's dig into this reconciliation as an ongoing process, and how, I mean, will the survivors of Mother Emanuel ever be reconciled? Will the AME Church ever be reconciled? I struggle with that in this book.
It is such a nuanced term. Let me begin by saying, from a conceptual framework, I think about reconciliation, and I write about this in the first book, in Call to Reconciliation. I think about reconciliation as much more of a journey than a destination. It is an ongoing process whereby peoples come together, peoples plural, people of different backgrounds come together. Now, the term is nuanced. And if there is a justifiable pushback, some will say, how can you talk about reconciliation, which means to put back together, when in America, we really have not had conciliatory relationships in the first place. We've had domination, we've had subjugation, but we have not had equality. So we did not begin with groups that were together. How can you now talk about putting them back together? Very, very nuanced. In the final chapter, or maybe the fourth chapter of my previous work, Call to Reconciliation, I talk, if there ever is a destination of it, I look at the paradigm of Revelation 7:9, when the church triumphant comes together in the great cloud of witnesses manifest, with multiple ethnicities, with multiple racial groups, with people coming together with ultimate diversity, something I liken as a native of Louisiana to gumbo. I liken it as a space that is the antithesis of the white replacement theory. As you lifted up the Emanuel 9, you will recall the 6-shooter there left a white manifesto claiming that African Americans are replacing whites in the hierarchy of society as well as in sheer numbers. Last year, a similar manifesto was left after the Buffalo shootings at the outside the Tops grocery store. The white replacement theory, some people call it the great replacement theory. My theology of gumbo is just the opposite. It says that shrimp don't compete with okra. Okra doesn't compete with chicken. They all work together in community and complement one another, right? So that is what reconciliation is supposed to be about people coming together. But to your point, with the very deep wounds that are opened with real conversations, with hard conversations, with the work of lament, it's difficult to think about coming to a place of full equity now. It's an ongoing process. It's a goal that we should strive for.
You know, what you just said, I think is interesting, and something that I want to sit here for a second, because so often people are willing to say, okay, when do we cut the check? When do we do this? When is this done? But understanding, just like grief, reconciliation, and I like this metaphor that you give us, reconciliation journey, it always is ongoing and takes different forms. Like the reconciliation that needed to happen after George Floyd. There was a beginning, and you see we're now diverging in these different places, and we're having discussions that we didn't think we were going to be having. Like, again, like looking at like the assault on affirmative action and diversity, equity, and inclusion programs on the one hand, and then this court magically coming up with this decision about Alabama deserves representatives that it should have already had. On the other hand, it's just this journey being ongoing. I never will forget. I was with the bishop in South Carolina a few years ago, and something happened. There was an incident that happened at an annual conference. It was a racial incident, and the bishop said, "We marched in the '60s. We never thought that we'd have to march 30 years later," and understanding that. Just like the arc, I'm going to get this wrong, but the arc of the universe.
The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice.
The long piece, the long piece in there, the fact that we've been through Reconstruction and the backlash, like you talk about in the book. We've been through the civil rights movement and the backlash. And you articulate these historic narratives of the book and show us how reconciliation and these processes are processes and their walks. So I just, but I think sometimes persons who are the aggrieved, persons who are the aggressors, sometimes want to just pay and be done, not realizing that there is no easy way to reconcile. That's not a silver bullet. You just can't pay reparations to go away, for the damage that has happened.
It is an ongoing process, and I appreciate you lifting up those parallels that I attempt to draw in the book, the historical parallels. If you look at all of the progress that was made in Reconstruction, there certainly was a period of regress in the post-Reconstruction period of retrenchment or redemption, right? Where rights were taken away. In 1877, when the troops were withdrawn from the South, all HELL broke loose around the narrative of race and racial subjugation. If you think about the progress that was made with Martin King and others who led during the civil rights movement, certainly there was a deliberate attempt to move toward law and order, as Richard Nixon said when he campaigned in 1968. And I talk about that a great deal in Call to Reconciliation. And there was a period of regress with his rule and his administration in terms of relations, racial and ethnic relations in the United States. More recently, there obviously was a period, we all celebrate the period, unprecedented prosperity in America, economic prosperity, and the aesthetics of an African-American man as president. Amazing progress there with the administration of President Barack Obama, but clearly a period of tremendous regress with the narrative of Make America Great Again. So we've seen these parallels throughout the course of history. To your point, the arc of the moral universe is long, but I believe with great optimism as a Christian, it does bend toward justice. So we've got to continue the hard work of reconciliation, trying to bring people together and undo these narratives, the cultural norms of injustice and racial dominance and racial subjugation that existed in the 60s, to your point about what the bishop lifted up then. And here we are, the more things change, the more they stay the same. So it is an ongoing process, and it's not for the faint at heart, but it certainly is inherently left to us as members of the Christian church.
I want to get to one more question before we go to our first commercial break. So teasing out this, you've talked about the groundwork of this prophetic preaching and the fact that prophets preaching and preaching being inherently political, but that's predicated, you talk a bit about theological training and the importance of seminary and the importance of, like, when you bring up Martin Luther King and Bonhoeffer, showing how their seminary formation shifted and molded them. But what we're seeing today, though, is this rise of, and especially in the Black community, supposedly, this Black church, and, we know that the Black church is the conscience of the Black community, which is supposed to be the conscience of this nation. But when we have mega churches and non-denominational or churches that are being formed by persons who literally may have gone to no seminary, or worse, gone to a seminary preaching a theology that is antithetical to a social justice ministry.
Preacher.
How does that influence prophetic preaching? What happens when the Black church starts to talk about things and look at things in this way, when prosperity gospel seeps into our very bones and in these biggest places? And so when you see the main lines, like the AME Church, AME, Zion, CME, National Baptist, the traditional Baptists, these traditional churches going into somewhat of a decline, it's no great secret that our numbers are shifting, and seeing persons going to churches where the theology is scarce, specious, or dangerous, what do we do with that? How does that impact this prophetic preaching that you've placed, whose mantles you've placed upon the Black church?
So I believe prophetic preaching is inherently important. It is the sort of preaching, as some categorize, and I cite in the book, when the minister is willing to get his or herself into trouble. When the minister is willing to take not just an insular perspective and looking at the congregation in a limited capacity, but looking at universally at themes of justice and how the congregation fits into a much broader perspective. Prophetic preaching is inherently political, but not all ministers are willing to be political. Again, I emphasize, I'm not talking partisan, I'm talking political. Not all ministers are willing to go there. Even in the Black church tradition, there has long been a conflict between piety and politics. I lift up the wonderful work by the Reverend Dr. U.S. Senator Raphael Warnock, his book on the divided mind of the Black church, where he documents much of the historical narrative that has influenced where we are here in the 21st century. In the 20th century, if I were to illustrate that construct, or those constructs rather, the differences just in the Black church, I think most popularly, clearly, Dr. King was into prophetic leadership. He was into social justice issues and into political leadership. When I think about Joe Jackson, however, he was someone who was more into piety. He was a leader in the Baptist tradition and a leader in Black Christianity who was much more so into piety, in praying, focusing on salvation and the kingdom to come, but not willing to deal with social inequities here in the kingdom at hand. So the Black church has been at odds with itself, not just now, but historically, with respect to piety and politics. With respect to the rise of the mega church, as I have seen, and I cite our fellow AME brother, Dr. Eric McDaniel, a dear friend, a fraternity brother, his last book, not the most recent, but his last book, Politics in the Pews, which is published by the University of Michigan Press. Dr. McDaniel goes through several criteria, I should say in plural, looking at how churches engage in political activity, not partisan activity, but engage in political activity. And it begins with a willingness of the minister to be political, to address those social issues and not be limited only to holy issues, if you will. So it is something that may very well relate to seminary training. I'd like to thank my theological education, my exposure at Duke, my exposure at United Theological Seminary certainly has influenced me more on the liberal, on the left-leaning side of Christianity. But to your point, I do recognize that some other seminaries that are much, much more conservative have influenced pastors to engage in piety and pietistic preaching opposed to prophetic preaching. And I think that's part of a truncated gospel.
And thank you for bringing up that pietistic preaching. That's something that I'm glad we're hearing, because political, there are different ways. Like, I would argue that this pietistic preaching is political. I mean, look at how the evangelicals are preaching and what they advocate for is clearly, and what evangelicals, I hate the fact that word's been hijacked by a certain source of American gospel, but the whole recent debates on abortion that we are having in this country, what is being said from whose pulpit. And, you're looking at certain churches doing one thing and then turning right around and doing it. And that you have other churches doing something else. It's very, very interesting, and I would argue, like I tell my students in my classes, everything's political, whether you slap a name on it or not. So with that, we are going to go to our first commercial break, and we'll be back in a second.
And so part of what I am inviting people to do as we go in this campaign, I invite them to become a part of the Cooper experience, because you want to know that the person that would be a bishop has sufficient experience and understanding and knowledge of the denomination and its workings and its ways, that they can serve well, serve the people well, serve the denomination well as a bishop in the church. And so I'm asking people to become a part of the Cooper experience, because I believe it is the kind of experience you can trust. You can trust me to do well, be well, and administer well as one of the bishops of the church. And so I ask you to become a part of the Cooper experience, because it is an experience you can trust.
And we're back. Once again, we are here with Reverend Dr. J. Augustine, member of the Judicial Council, pastor of St. Joseph's AME Church in Durham, and the national chaplain of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated. I think I got all the things that you got. Yes, I let you get by with that 8-2 stuff, and I'm going to. It's your day here, so I'm just going to.
Look, God loves the Sigmas too. God loves the Sigmas too.
Thank you. But so we've been here talking about this great book, When Prophets Preach. I'm going to ask if we could flash the title on the screen so that you all can see it. It is available where all major booksellers are sold. This was done by Fortress Press, but of course, it is available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble. I think our bookstore may or may not have a link to it. But anyway, it is retailing right now for, I believe, $19.99. Though on Amazon, it is $17.99. Prophets Preach, Leadership and the Politics of the Pulpit. So we encourage you to go read this book and support Dr. Augustine as he attempts to remake how Christianity is thought, shared, and practiced in this country. So when we were at the break, we were talking about, you brought up Eric McDaniel. That actually leads us to this, to my next question. Dr. McDaniel, aside from being, all those wonderful things you said, yes, he's an alpha, yes, he's your fraternity brother, we know, but Eric McDaniel is a good friend of mine, and he's actually a political scientist, and that's important because so often we talk about things from this. We know about AME theologians. We know about AME persons who are practical scholars, like in person with demons, like lawyers like yourself. But AME academics who are not in religion sometimes don't get enough play or don't get enough attention. So I'm glad that you highlighted Eric McDaniel, who actually did his research through Bishop Henning and was at, I think, the 1996 General Conference passing out surveys to do his work. But you engage with Dr. McDaniel and you talk about his work, Polished to the Pews. And Eric has his second book out right now that is engaging with a broader question of religious nationalism in this country. So I want to put this question to you. What are some of your contributions that you want to make in academia writ large? Because this book is not just a book that is destined for the pews and for seminaries. Also, you're inserting yourself in an academic discussion and using because I know you teach in law, you've taught both law and you've also taught both in seminary. So take us down up to 30,000 feet. What academic contributions are you trying to make here?
Thank you so much for the question. And let me just, since you referenced Dr. McDaniel, his work, the more recent book on white Christian nationalism, it's a powerful read. He has co-authors with it. I give great credit to all of them for the body of work that they put together there. In Cambridge University Press, I believe, is the publisher, Cambridge or Oxford Press, but obviously a very well-researched and well-documented work that makes a very significant contribution to society. And to lead into your question, which I thank you for, that is what I want to do academically, just as I pray I'm doing as a pastor ecclesially. I want to do so academically to make a very significant contribution to society. Historically, I have had the opportunity as a lawyer. I'm a proud graduate of Tulane University Law School. I earned my doctorate of ministry at Duke University. I have had the opportunity to teach at Southern University Law Center. I've taught at North Carolina Central University Law School. I have taught at Duke Divinity School. I have had the good fortune of teaching at Jarvis Christian College as well. My goal, building upon the body of research, I've published more than 24 academic articles in various interdisciplinary journals around the United States. My goal would be to build on that body of research and continually make a positive contribution. And I deeply appreciate the compliments that you shared regarding my work. Ultimately, I look at mentors, rest his soul now, Calvin Butts, a phenomenal human being, a prophetic preacher who led Abyssinian Baptist Church, I would say, to even higher heights in building upon the leadership of Adam Clayton Powell Jr., Adam Clayton Powell Sr. prior to him, took Abyssinian to even higher heights. And for probably 20 years of his tenure as a pastor, he also served as a university president. He gave significant leadership in New York that opened doors of opportunity for so many. I look in our own denomination at the great work of Floyd Flake, the wonderful work he has done with his wonderful wife at Greater Allen in New York. I look at his academic leadership as a president of one of our own institutions of Wilberforce, his alma mater, if I'm not mistaken. And I also think about his political leadership in Congress. Again, the goal through those different domains, the goal making a very significant contribution to society, opening doors of opportunity. I'd like to think I have the capacity to do some of those same things. So if that means continuing to serve in academic leadership, continuing to serve in ecclesial or in church leadership, if that means one day serving in university leadership as a president or so, we will see what the future holds. But as long as I am positively contributing to society, I'm happy. And those are things that I want to continually at least try to do.
I was wondering when you were going to hit the university thing, because I said, wait a minute, Butt served as president, Flake served as president. It's like, okay, I see you right here. But in all seriousness, I thank you for this, because so often, sometimes these books are written in a narrow vein. And I looked at the persons who made these wonderful blurbs and comments, and, the large majority of them are pastors, preachers, but this book speaks to a broader place. So you put yourself in a broader discussion, and I want to acknowledge and honor that. And I would just say that Dr. McDaniel's new book is The Everyday Crusade. For those of y'all who want to dig into it, it is an academic book now. This is not as easy to read as Jay's book is, but it is definitely a book, if you have the chops and time for it, worth reading to really see what is going on with American Christianity to this day. And again, I was actually in New York last week, and I drove by Abyssinia, you still see Dr. Butt's name still on the marquee, because they haven't gotten a new pastor yet, So it really is. Thank you for remembering, that great brother who gave a lot to Christendom and American Christianity and Black Christianity as a whole, and a faithful son of Morehouse College.
You took the thought out of my mind. Touche.
So we were talking about this in the beginning of the call, back on this theme of reconciliation, and you bring up the Evangelical Lutheran Church and the United Methodist Church in your discussion on reconciliation as two models that are going on. But how do we juxtapose this concern with the issues going on today with mainline denominations and LGBTQ populations? For instance, we're seeing in the United Methodist Church, we are estimating that 15% of the U.S.-based United Methodist churches are going to withdraw from the denomination. We don't know how big the global split will be. And we also know the ELCA has had some challenges. For instance, the first trans bishop that was elected 2 years ago had to resign due to certain issues, and there have been some other challenges in both those communions. So how do you talk about the reconciliation, but it's June. We're also in the middle of Pride Month, and you talk about Pride Month in the book, which we're going to get to at the end of this. So how do we deal with that piece of reconciliation? Because reconciliation isn't just about race.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It is about full egalitarianism. It's about full equality for humanity and respecting the space that we all are different. It is not about trying to create a melting pot of yesteryear. I hate that analogy, because it denotes a watering down or an attempt to melt to become one. We are not one. We are all very different. We should be celebrated as different, and we should be lifted up because of our differences. That is part of what reconciliation is all about. I do recognize those shortcomings in both denominations that you referenced, the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, as well as our United Methodist brothers and sisters, or United Methodist siblings, I should say, forgive me. I lift up the Evangelical Lutheran Church. In my context, for example, I'm very close with Bishop Tim Smith, the bishop of the North Carolina Synod. He did a wonderful endorsement for my previous book, Call to Reconciliation, had it as a book study for his entire synod, for all evangelical Lutheran pastors in the state of North Carolina, because he found that that's substantively valuable for ministry. I lift him up because we have worked collaboratively, and certainly in the local context with St. Paul's Evangelical Lutheran Church in Lutheran. We've worked to celebrate, memorialize, I should say, services of lament and reconciliation each year for the Emmanuel 9. It is particular, and it's particularly important, and it's special that we're in partnership with them because the sick, bigoted shooter was a member of his denomination. And Bishop Smith has been forthright, very public in saying we are the whitest denomination in America. We have to do better. We've got to own this narrative. This is part of lament. This is part of the hard work of lament that I referenced. We've got to own this, and we've got to make amends for this in the future. I celebrate that level of honesty. I celebrate that level of transparency, and I lift that up. I wish all of us could be that transparent and that open and honest. Now, with respect to our United Methodist siblings, it is so very unfortunate. I'm not only a Duke graduate, I serve on the Board of Visitors at Duke Divinity School. And as our viewers may or may not know, Duke University and Duke Divinity School are ministries of the United Methodist Church. It is so unfortunate that the church is having the internal differences it is, the splits because of sexual orientation and the like. All must mean all, and we are all God's children. That to me is as evident in the gospel as evident can be, but obviously not all of us feel that way. So that is very regrettable. That is, in my estimation, the antithesis of reconciliation, because that's not bringing people together. It's not bringing a people in community with the proverbial other. It is segregating. It is tearing apart based on political ideology, and quite frankly, based on what I think is an oppressive ideology. So very unfortunate. And I just think we all have got to do better, which is, again, why, going back to our previous segment of dialogue, which is why reconciliation, I believe, is an ongoing process opposed to a destination. It's a continual journey.
And it's interesting, like I said, we're in June, and this time last year for Pride Month, we had a great dialogue with persons from National Human Rights Campaign, HRC, where we screened their film, which was filmed partially in Metropolitan AME Church, talking about rapprochement, the rapprochement that is needed with the African American church and our LGBTQ siblings, both those who are in our pews today, in our pulpits today, and those who had to leave or left. Yes. And, I want to highlight the fact that this June, we are we are continuing the discussion that we began at General Conference. And part of the marquee items in Convo is the discussion of the human sexuality working group that was authorized by the General Conference. Now, I know in the AME Church, we have a whole lot of things going on, and our minds have been our attention spans have been put towards some other issues. But nonetheless, this issue was important enough to bring the General Conference to a halt, and it deserves our attention. And, I just appreciate what you're saying, what you've said. I hope that you will be engaged in the process as someone, who will speak for those who can't, frankly, in some districts still feel scared to speak for themselves, because we can't look at reconciliation regarding this community and look at our ELCA and UMC siblings who are at least having the discussion, whereas in our denomination, where some persons would want us to have a gag order and keep on moving. So
yeah, and that is unfortunate. That's part of a truncated gospel. We've got to own our shortcomings. That's part of lament. That's part of recognizing who we are and that we're not perfect. And it's part of vowing to do better, or vowing to at least try to do better. And to try to do better, we've got to own the issues and address them. I have been very forthright in my ministry, especially this is the month of June. I'm always big on Pentecost. I'm always big on, and Pentecost usually coincides just about with the beginning of Pride Month. And in this year, I believe it was the last Sunday of May, and obviously June, the first Sunday of June, the first Sunday of Pride Month, the following week. But I'm big on diversity. Diversity means varied things. It's not just black and white. It's all of us as siblings in Christ. Church has got to be a place of welcome. It's got to be a place where he is welcome. It's got to be a place where she is welcome. It's got to be a place where they are welcomed. I am very fortunate to serve a very forward-thinking congregation, a congregation that embraces diversity. And quite frankly, they love it when their pastor embraces diversity and has open arms for all of God's children. In all, I emphatically, all means all. So thank you very much for lifting that up. I've been very clear, consistently clear on how I feel about equality among all of our siblings. And I think church has got to be a place where we all can come to be soulfully nourished, to come together, to organize, and how can we pursue a collective agenda of advancement in our community. We can't do that if we're fractured within.
And I want to get one more question before we get to our final commercial break. So, digging through the book, there's so much in this book. You know, y'all really should buy this book. But I was taken to chapter 4, where you juxtapose Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Martin Luther King. Now, you spend more time with Dietrich Bonhoeffer, I assume, because King's story is, as you like, the rest is history. We pretty much know King's story, but I was fascinated to learn more about Dietrich Bonhoeffer and what led you to contrast their personalities.
So they both are prophetic leaders. I lift both of them up in their respective contexts as prophetic leaders, but their prophetic leadership came about because of different reasons. And I put them in conversation to illustrate the differences really between racial discrimination and ethnic discrimination, because both have become so very prevalent with the narrative of white Christian nationalism in America that has been largely associated with Make America Great Again. Bonhoeffer was was someone who came to America as a German, who came to America and through the lens of empathy, in studying at Union Seminary in New York, in having friends, in particular Albert. I'm butchering Albert Frazier from Alabama, a gentleman who graduated from Howard University. He learned about race, and through empathy, he saw racial discrimination and racial injustices in America and said, my God, God knows suffering because Jesus knows suffering, and God was with Jesus. God is with Black Americans. The lens of empathy that I approached Bonhoeffer through, I was influenced by a great read, and I want to give credit where credit is due. Reggie Williams writes a compelling book, Bonhoeffer's Black Jesus. It's really an account of the year Bonhoeffer spent, postdoc time he spent in New York at Union Seminary, and how he just really saw racism up close and personal. Now, race is a social construct, and it's based on immutable characteristic. It's based on something that cannot change. Ethnicity, however, is different because ethnicity is much more nuanced. It may be based on your religion, as in Jews may be victim of discrimination when you can't tell the difference between somebody who is quote unquote American white and Jewish white, if you will, right? Or let me say Protestant white and Jewish white, if I can put it in that context, right? So ethnicity is much more nuanced. Ethnicity may deal with discrimination against immigrants simply because they're from a different place than America. Much more nuanced, but Bonhoeffer goes back to Nazi Germany, and as a German who certainly could and looked the part, who certainly could have sided with Hitler in Germany's Hitler's Third Reich, he's somebody who empathically embraced Jews and consequentially ended up giving his life for the things he believed in. So I lift him up as somebody who showed empathy and who was a prophetic leader in the context of ethnic discrimination. And clearly, as you say, with Dr. King, we all know that wonderful story, and it's laid out earlier at the early parts of the book foundationally, and looking at the politics of King. He's somebody that stood in the face of racial discrimination. So the two are very important figures and certainly have influenced my life in a major way.
It's interesting that you split up race and ethnicity so easily and elegantly. I wish I could take you to one of my political science conferences, because there are some who argue that race is merely a subset of ethnicity with no special valence, and it's very interesting. So
the American narrative, time and time again, we have assigned, and Eddie Glaude had a powerful read prior to his last book, Begin Again, Democracy in Black, where he talks about the nuances of race and about the value associated therewith, and about how whiteness is valued at a certain level, the pinnacle of valuation there, and how blackness is so far down at the lowest part of the totem pole. And that plays out in our politics, that plays out in the valuation of property, that plays out time and time again with ownership of things. So race is a social construct, but it is certainly different from ethnicity.
And it's interesting because people try to collapse them in certain works and say, well, racial violence. No, there are some very different laden values with race. So
Absolutely.
Thank you for having that discussion. Because I'm gonna have to bring you to like some conferences of mine. Like, this is the man. If you don't listen to this man. But let's hit our second commercial, and then we'll come back for our final question.
I am the Reverend Jared Britton Washington, and I am seeking your prayerful support for the office of Chief Information Officer of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. We are grateful that in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, this Chief Information Officer, known as the General Secretary, has a duty to be a bridge builder, to bring together the technologically sophisticated with the technologically challenged, and to navigate how God allows us to affect change, to keep records, and to make certain that the AME Church is accountable on all levels. And so, my brothers and my sisters, I am grateful for the opportunity to present myself to the AME Church. I know that when God gifted me, God made me to be a man of God who loves God's people, who understands promptness, who understands accountability, who understands the ability to be objective in all scenarios and situations, and who loves the spirit of enthusiasm. I am grateful that God has blessed me to be presented before great men and women of God, and I am grateful for the various gifts that God has given me over the course of the years that I have lived this life. Continue to pray for me, pray with me, and know that God is going to bless us in this journey, because I don't just believe that the best is yet to come. I believe the best is right here now, and greater is on the way.
All right, and we're back for our final portion of this great discussion with Reverend Dr. J. Augustine, talking about When Prophets Preach. We encourage you to pick this book up. It is available at all major booksellers. This is a rich tome that will take you through a brief historical, political history of the United States. It gives you a little bit of theology, it gives you a little bit of American political development, and it even gives you a little bit of liturgical inspiration. This is where I want to take to the final question. So in the last chapter of the book, one of the things you talk about is incorporating the sacred and the secular in the church calendar. This particularly struck me because, you know, one of our mutual good friends, my colleague, Dr. Roderick Beelan, is an aficionado of making sure that churches understand liturgical seasons, but understanding that the liturgy is designed to, the liturgical calendar is designed to guide us through the Christian year and inspire our faith. And I like how in this same way, you graft onto the church social events to help the church gird its social justice witness, its political witness. Can you speak a little bit more about this portion of your book?
Absolutely. And thank you for calling the name of our dear friend, the Reverend Dr. Roderick D. Beelan, a wonderful human being. And I'm thankful for the years of friendship that we've shared. As I think about the church calendar, of course, it begins with the liturgical calendar, with the respective seasons. The beginning of the church year, of course, is the Advent season. But there are so many other things that we traditionally celebrate, so many other observances in the church. Why not think about a church calendar, particularly in our denominational perspective? In Methodism, I just hosted annual conference. St. Joseph was just the host of the Western North Carolina annual conference. Thank God for Bishop James LeVert Davis. Thank God for the people of St. Joseph. I'm back now with my 5th appointment. But this is the 5th time in this particular congregation I've had an opportunity to do a true up, to plan a forward thinking where we're going. And I do so, thank you for mentioning, by bringing the sacred and secular together in a church calendar. Illustratively, the Advent season begins a high holy time of expectancy. It is also a time where we will celebrate at the end of Thanksgiving, obviously, Christmas, a very Christocentric holiday, the essence of Christianity. But we come with Watch Night. We come with part of the political witness of emancipation. January begins a time where we in the Black church in particular, but I would argue white churches as well, should always observe Martin Luther King Jr. Day, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day, because of the import of his leadership. You go just 2 weeks down the line, obviously February is Black History Month. You approach a time there where the liturgical seasons will change. We've been through Epiphany. You're approaching a time, obviously, where you will move into the Lenten season. That is a time of deep introspective reflection. It is also a time to celebrate on Sundays. I think Sundays are a cheat day, right? It's a time to celebrate on Sundays the victories that we have in terms of our African American story of who we are and how we overcame. If you celebrate February as Black History Month, you have to celebrate the Places of Church of Equality. You have to celebrate March as Women's History Month for all of the significant contributions our sisters have made in the United States of America. When I think about other examples of the calendar, clearly the time period between September and October, Hispanic Heritage Month. Some people may say, well, hey, there are no Hispanic people in our church. Well, it's a great place of education. It's a great place of opportunity to learn about others, to learn about the proverbial other with a capital O, the individuals who are not like you, because church is supposed to be a place of welcome for all. So that 5th chapter in the book really was born out of listening, 4 years ago when I was initially assigned to serve St. Joseph. I read a book about onboarding from the Harvard Business Review called The First 90 Days. And if I were to take what that book said and put it in a nutshell, it's listen more and talk less. I listened to the congregation. I met with each and every auxiliary. I held a church conference and I gave them back what I got. I did a PowerPoint presentation and a SWOT analysis, and I gave them back what I got from them by asking fixed questions. And everything I heard was that we want to be in the business of social justice. We want to be out front in the community. So it was important for me as a leader to be responsive to what the members of the congregation I was sent to serve were interested in. But obviously, as you lift up Dr. Beelan, obviously it's also important to be grounded in the liturgies of the church, because this isn't Alpha, this isn't Sigma, this isn't Morehouse, this isn't Howard, this is the church. So in bringing the two together and bringing the sacred and secular together, we have had a wonderful time the last 4 years at St. Joseph, and I'm optimistic that the best is yet to come. But it's very, very important, I believe, from our prophetic perspective, to make church a place of welcome for all. June is Pride Month in America. October is a time where we call out domestic violence. We should have awareness about the troublesome disease that is. October is also a time where we are aware of cancer, and it's a time of great cathartic relief when people can come together in ashe and pour libations and lament about ancestors who are gone on, and have a place of vulnerability and cry and pray and share with others in dealing with the disease right now. So those are just a few examples of how I try to bring the sacred calendar and the secular calendar together to create a place of holistic belonging, so everybody has a place in the church. That's really what Revelation 7:9 is all about. It's all about bringing people together and creating a space of holistic healing. That is what the church triumphant is all about. That's what I'm trying to do here in the church militant.
Well, it's interesting. I had a pastor, and I'm not going to out him on this call, but I had a pastor message me today and say, I'm looking at starting a social justice ministry in my church. What are some things you could do? What are some thoughts? And I said, go buy J. Augustine's book, read chapter 5, and call me back. So I'm going to see if he takes my advice, and we'll see what happens. But Jay, it's been a joy to have you here. Thank you for being with us. And, I'm looking forward to this being seen. And again, we wanted to record this for 2 reasons. One, our first book for the year we did with Melinda Contreras-Bird's amazing edited volume on Holy Black Rage. And we're now moving from acknowledging and embracing the rage that we have to looking at the prophetic preaching that should be in all of our pulpits, and how politics, it's okay to be involved in politics. Jesus was involved in politics. Politics is not a dirty word. And I appreciate that. And in this book, you don't only give food for the mind, you also give some tangible things that churches can do to deal with this. And that's why, as this comes out, as we celebrate Juneteenth, there are things that we need to do to continue this, onward march towards liberation. So, Jay, thank you. Any last words before we wrap up?
It is a pleasure to be with you. I'm deeply appreciative. Anyone who would like to know more about me, my website is www.jayaugustine, that's jaugustine.com. I'm on all social media platforms at jaugustine9. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be with you and share. I deeply, deeply appreciate you.
So we're going to give the tech team a second to put that up, and I'm going to give a few last minute announcements. Again, do not forget to pick this book up, When Prophets Preach. And also, they can find your Social Justice Sundays. You do those how often a year?
There are certainly once a quarter.
Okay.
As we're here in June, there is a wonderful tribute we give every year in Durham. Some historical figures in our church, Virginia Williams and attorney Billy Marsh, who's gone on to glory now, former member of the Judicial Council. The Royal Ice Cream Sit-In, they were leaders in that in 1957. That was an act of civil disobedience, which obviously predated the lunch counter sit-ins of Greensboro in 1960 and the Freedom Rides in 1961. So the first Social Justice Sunday we had at St. Joseph back in 2019 was to celebrate the Royal Ice Cream Sit-In. We're prepared to do that again this year. Our guest speaker will be Cynthia Butler McIntyre, past national president of Delta Sigma Theta, a dear family friend from New Orleans, and a wonderful, wonderful speaker. The next Social Justice Sunday we'll have will commemorate the anniversary. This is the 60th anniversary of the March on Washington. That certainly was the second Social Justice Sunday we had after I was assigned here at St. Joseph in 2019. And fortunately then, my HU sister, who happens to be the vice president of the United States of America now, at that time was campaigning for president. We were delighted that she was able to accept our invitation and to be with us that day to commemorate again the anniversary of the March on Washington. So we certainly have them once a quarter. Thematically, those two are non-negotiable. The other two may vary, but it's something that is so important to celebrate who we are. It creates a place of welcome for all of us in the community, and it's something that the church has really, really rallied behind. It's an exciting time, and thank you for calling it out.
Well, and also we have the website up, so thank you. But I also, even if you can't make it to Durham, North Carolina, you can definitely see those services online. And I've been able to tune in for a few of them. You've had some amazing speakers, and also, as we know, going on this year for our AME family out there, this week is also General Board. So we'll be engaging General Board. There's also, this is the year of the ennials. So you might see me at quadrennial, biennial, or some other ennial. So please feel free to come up to myself, and reach out. We want to know how you're appreciating the Christian Recorder. And I know Dr. Augustine will be at an ennial as well. So, if you don't have a copy of your book on hand to have him sign, you can just tell him how much you enjoyed reading your copy on your Kindle device.
All right.
And with that, thank you so much, Jay. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. And we will see you on our next edition of the TCR Dialogues.
Thank you.